Adam?
Hey Dan, how's it going?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Great. I'll intro both of us. I'm Dan Foster, news editor, National Review Online, and you are Adam Serwer. Am I saying that right? We're
Yes.
Twitter buddies, but I think this is the first time we.
No, you said it right. You said it
Okay,
right.
Adam Serwer, you're staff writer at the American Prospect.
Yep.
And here we are doing Blogging Heads, and I think the thing that's at least on my mind is the Pigford case. You responded to a response of mine, and I've had the words genteel white populist bouncing around in my brain ever since that response. I think that's the first time I've been called that. So do you want to do some exposition? You want to let the folks know kind of what we're talking about, and then we can get into it a little bit.
Well, why don't you do the exposition since since you did it, you extensively reported it. So
sure. So Timothy Pigford was a black farmer in North Carolina, and he had a real rough go of it. And he turned into a kind of crusader because he was convinced that the USDA, through this New Deal era program that gave loan guarantees to farmers, he was convinced that they were discriminating against him because he was black. And indeed, if you look at the details of his case, there's fairly good evidence that that's true. Mm-hmm. I think I said in my article that it was a coin flip. You know, I'm not the judge in the case, but if you look at the evidence, the USDA did an internal investigation. They found the people who denied him, the parties who denied him loans, to be not guilty of any kind of racial discrimination, or at least any kind of intentional racial discrimination. But there's certainly statistical evidence that not just Pigford, but black farmers in general were discriminated against throughout the 70s, 80s, and early 90s in the South. I think we can both stipulate that and agree to that. There was certainly statistical evidence that, for instance, they had to wait much longer for loans to clear, which is a big impediment when you're a farmer because you need an operating loan in time to get your harvest out, and that their loans were often for smaller amounts, and that their loans were often held up for bureaucratic reasons where similarly situated white farmers' loans were not. Okay, so what happened was Pigford spent 20 years lobbying Congress, lobbying the federal court system, lobbying presidents of the United States, and trial lawyers to take up his cause. Finally, in the late 90s, under the Clinton administration, this thing reached critical mass. They were about to go to trial. They had class action certification, and then we had this big, momentous settlement between the USDA and the federal government and this as yet undefined class of black farmers who were discriminated against. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the story that I reported is what happened since then, which is, in short, you had Pigford 1, which was a $1 billion+ settlement that distributed about the vast majority of the claims were in chunks of $50,000 to 16 or 17,000 so far, black farmers who were purportedly discriminated against. And then you recently had, under President Obama, Pigford 2, which authorizes another $1 billion and change to go to claimants that filed after the original deadline of the first settlement. So hopefully that's enough context for people who are listening to it. I heartily recommend that they read both the piece and of course your response to it, because it's a somewhat boring topic for a lot of people. It's a complicated topic, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, I think it's a little. I mean, it's a little baroque.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, the suggestion I made, and that I guess you'll I'll make my case, and you can sort of rehearse your response to it. But I read your response, and the case I made was basically that there's pretty good reason to believe that there's widespread fraud in Pigford 1, and that'll only get worse in Pigford 2. And and you say, I think rightly, that I haven't demonstrated strictly that there is widespread fraud. Mm-hmm. And I think I'll yield that. What I would say to that, though, is that the case I make, and that the case that a lot of people who have problems with this are making, is, as it were, structural or perhaps forensic is the way to put it. So what we have is a really, really low evidentiary bar, and we can talk about why the bar is low to collect. And this is the words of the judge who wrote the consent decree, the settlement, to collect a quote unquote almost automatic $50,000 cash payment. So basically, what you have to prove to get $50,000 through the Pigford settlement is that, one, you're African American, and two, you attempted to farm or attempted to secure funds through one of these USDA programs to operate or start a farm. Now, the only thing you have to do to prove that, you don't need to hit the standard preponderance of evidence standard that's the sort of the standard in civil cases. You have to show quote unquote substantial evidence, which is quote unquote again more than a mere scintilla. And in this case, it often amounts to somebody who's not a direct family member of yours signing an affidavit, right? So this is this low evidentiary standard to get a cash settlement. Now, originally, there was also debt forgiveness, and there was also priority access to future USDA loans, which almost unarguably were much more important to the struggling black farmers who were originally part of this, who were originally part of the class, the few hundred farmers who originally filed suit, and that debt relief and that access to future loans has not come through for a lot of the members of the original class, and they're pretty ticked off about it. Okay, so we have these $50,000 cash. I can already see it, feel our viewers going to sleep. By the way, so you have these $50,000 cash payments with a really low evidentiary standard. You've got a very sympathetic judge who starts off his ruling with the words 40 acres and a mule. Okay, and you see where it goes from there. You've got an administration in the Clinton administration that has completely eliminated the adversarial nature of this court proceeding in this settlement and has said that they're going to be partners with the Pigford farmer class. That carried forth into the Bush administration, totally, and carried forth into the Obama administration as well. And you've got an interest group culture that's grown around Pigford that is pretty transparently associated with the reparations movement, and in a couple cases, the Nation of Islam, and prominent prominent advocates for Pigford 1 and Pigford 2, have said basically that this, I refer you to my piece in the response, that this is a proxy for reparations, and that frankly they don't care if everyone who's collecting these payments are not in fact black farmers. So and then, and last but not least, you have anecdotes of actual fraud. There have been arrests made for fraud in the South. You have whistleblowers who have talked to me, but more extensively to Breitbart and his outfit, who have talked about the claims process and how in the USDA they haven't been fighting claims at all. They've just been rubber stamping them and passing them on to this third party adjudicator that decides who gets paid. And you have people talking about coordinated fraud at the level of black activists in the South teaching people how to game the system. Okay, so my point is that you combine all of this, you look at this stuff, and you see a kind of forensic case for at least a space for widespread massive fraud, okay? And then what you have are the numbers of actual claimants. So there are some 94,000 claimants so far. Most of them came in after the deadline. The official deadline for collecting, and by anyone's accounting, I've had this argument with a lot of people, by anyone's accounting, there's no way to get to half that number in terms of how many black farmers there are in the United States, or how many there were during the relevant years. So my response to your response, and again, I recommend people read it so they can get some more context here, is that it's clear that there just is widespread fraud in Pigford. The open question, and I think we can agree on this, is how much of it is getting caught. So people are submitting fraudulent claims by the thousands, just based on the pure numbers of it. How many claims versus how many total black farmers there are. The question is how much of it is getting caught. And I would say that the forensic case or the structural case or just how the settlement works suggests that probably a lot of it's getting through.
Well, I contest a couple of things. So the numbers on how many black farmers there are actually really nebulous. And I take this sort of the Congressional Research Service at their word when they say they weren't counting black farmers very well prior to, say, like the mid 90s. And we have, I guess, the earliest numbers we have where they start distinguishing between black farms and black farm operators is 1992, which is about 10 to 11 years after the discrimination is alleged to have started. And I think the larger context of this whole story, and this is the larger context of this whole story really is there were like a million black farmers at the turn of the century in like the 1900s, and there are like, a couple thousand now. And like that's really sort of a story of basically, the sort of Faustian bargain that New Deal Democrats made with, Southern white supremacist Democrats, was, sure, we'll sign on to this to people pumping all this money into the states, but the only way we'll do that is if you let us make sure that none of it ever gets to black people. So like that was basically how this stuff functioned, especially in the rural South, especially when it came to black farmers, which is sort of why there's this precipitous decline of black farmers over the 20th century.
But of course, there's a decline in the number of farmers. Period.
Yes, that's true too.
Over that same.
That's true too.
But you're saying it's proportionally far greater among black farmers.
Yeah, I mean, this is just the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. One of the first things it did really was sort of document how bad and widespread this was. This sort of practice. I mean, this is just sort of they did this with the GI Bill as well. I mean, it was just sort of an unspoken deal. Sure, Roosevelt will sign on to your we'll sign on to this stuff, all this stuff you want to do with government, as long as we can make sure it doesn't go to people we don't want it to get to.
Right.
This is just sort of how it worked. And the Pigford thing only really spans sort of a period of 10 to 15 years. And I think one of the things you mentioned in your article in your conclusion was sort of Obama saying, this is an end to a shameful period in our history. And I think that was actually largely, he was referring to that sort of larger practice. Like the USDA, for people who I think have been sort of paying peripheral attention to the Pigford case, I don't think all of them really sort of think about it as between, and even though they should, I mean, think about it as being between 10 and 15 years. It's sort of, it's emblematic of this broader issue that's been around for a long time. But as far as the actual numbers are concerned, I mean, I took issue with so in Pigford 1, part of the reason I took issue with the use of the 94,000 number is, of course, in Pigford 1, there's about a 31% claim denial rate, right? So there's actually only about 15,000 people who have seen any money, and about 7,000 other people who applied and didn't get money. And so the question is now, after the deadline for Pigford 1 ended, there's some 70,000 people who say we're farmers, or we attempted to farm and we're not getting money. And the question is now, is this indicative of indicative of a larger problem with people just filing thousands and thousands of fraudulent claims? And what I've said is, I don't think we really know that, even looking at the numbers, because the numbers we have are bad. But I think that, there's a couple things that have happened in Pigford 2 that are different. I mean, for one thing, the Government Accountability Office has access to is going to have access to all the claims information. Nobody's getting paid until all the claims are adjudicated. The GAO and the USDA Inspector General have to report to Congress. The attorneys can't have to sort of swear to the truth of the claim. They can't just sort of file claims file large amounts of claims and then get money from people who then get money. And there's and the adjudicators are more empowered to sort of make decisions about whether or not something in particular suspicious. But I also, I mean, like, the whole question of whether the USDA is rubber stamping these claims, I mean, I don't think we know what's happening in Pigford 2 yet because there's no adjudicator and there's nobody evaluating the claims, those larger claims, which I think are the ones people are really suspicious about. But even in Pigford 1, I mean, to have 31% of those claims being denied, that sort of literally means, they're not being rubber stamped. I mean, the USDA isn't just handing out money.
Well, I'm not sure that's true. Again, because, look at the way that this broke down, is that this is something I forgot to say, there was track A and track B. It's set up in how people got paid in the consent decree and the structure of the settlement. And the idea was that track A would be for people who had little or no documentary evidence that they had been denied recourse to one of these USDA loans. And the idea there was that the USDA was really bad at record keeping, and furthermore that the office charged with making sure that discrimination wasn't taking place was poorly run and that eventually folded. Now, again, all that I'll stipulate to. Mm-hmm. But what you had there is this really low bar to get this $50,000 cash payment. And again, you were supposed to also get, it was supposed to be tax-free, and you were supposed to also get debt relief and priority access to future USC loans. Okay, and then you had track B. Track B was for people who essentially wanted what they called mini trials. And they said, we have enough evidence, we've got clear-cut evidence that we were discriminated against, and we're going to, either hire counsel or represent ourselves. We're going to go and we're going to make our case in a day, and it's going to have roughly the same standard of evidence that any civil case would. And famously, Shirley Sherrod took this route. People don't know this. She operated a communal farm with her husband, and they successfully sued the USDA, or successfully got a Track B settlement under Pigford 1 for I think $13.5 million, the biggest single settlement in Pigford. Okay, but that's a higher standard of evidence. That's a mini trial. But what's ended up happening is that the vast and overwhelming majority of these payments come via Track A, and that's what you would think of as help me with the word, not punitive damages, right? As in sort of pain and suffering damages. Okay, so the vast majority of these payments are coming in the form of punitive damages. The promised debt relief has largely not materialized. I talked to a few black farmers who were in the original class, the few hundred in the original class. The promised debt relief is not materialized. They've given up their right by taking this Track A settlement to future legal action against the USDA for discrimination. And the USDA has been essentially held harmless from having to adjudicate any real or imagined discrimination that might have happened. So you've got this, the way things broke down is that the people who had the kind of the best cases of the original claims, they filed Track B claims, or in the case of some of the black farmers I talked to, they were pressured by trial lawyers who wanted to make a quick $12,000 with each claim to take this Track A settlement. Somebody put $50,000 in their pocket. They bought a John Deere or they paid off some debt, and 20 years later they're still as bad off or worse than they were before. So this is I'm not concern trolling here, but I'm suggesting that it's odd to me that we would perpetuate a system that makes quick cash available to as wide a class of African Americans as is conceivably possible under the terms of settlement, instead of going back and revisiting why the evidentiary standards, the things that could lead to systemic fraud. Yeah, it seems to me. And then again, when you consider, and this is where there's a danger of sounding conspiratorial, but when you consider the interest groups that have attached themselves to this cause, you start to wonder whether it's it hasn't just been politically engineered to be exactly what it is, which is a low bar for the wide and quick distribution of cash to as big a class of African Americans as possible, instead of targeted debt relief, access to loans, righting prior wrongs, and punitive damages, sure, but damages with a realistic standard of evidence. So
the standard of evidence thing is problematic, right? Because one of the problems is, so when Ronald Reagan comes into office, one of the things he does is he shuts down the civil rights office in the USDA, and this is sort. I mean, I see this as the beginning of the problem that started Pigford, which is that the office that investigates claims of discrimination is pretty much defunct by the early 80s. And so, I mean, the reason for the low standard of evidence in this case is the fact that you have people in the USDA who are literally like tossing civil rights claims in the trash. And so you've got a difficult problem, right? You have, I mean, like, it's understandable that the people being discriminated against wouldn't save proof that they were discriminated against because, because I mean, who thinks that they're ever going to get restitution for that? But on the government end, where you usually expect the government to have documentation of this stuff, they're just tossing the evidence in the trash. So you have a very difficult sort of problem where, on the one hand, if you make it so that, say, if you make the evidentiary standards as high as they are in Track B, you risk completely eliminating like thousands of people who were really discriminated against, but just have no evidence of it because the government threw away its own evidence, which is a way of allowing the government to get away with discriminating against people. On the other hand, we have we have the situation we have right now where the standard is fairly low. We have people like you who are really concerned that this thing is like being completely exploited beyond what it was originally meant to do. I'm not sure that the fact that, I mean, like, the people who attach themselves to this stuff, I mean, like, people like the Nation of, I mean, like, that's who you expect to attach themselves to a big story about the U.S. government discriminating against black people. I mean, these people are going to talk about this in this, I mean, they talk about everything in these tones. But, this is the prism through which they see things. So I'm not sure that their perception of this is necessarily the best lens to look at this through, because that's how they talk about pretty much anything. Yeah. I'm not disagreeing with you that there are people, I mean, obviously Breitbart played that audio of that guy. There's obviously con artists out there. Anytime there's a class action settlement with like with a class this wide, there's going to be con artists and people who are going to try to defraud the government. I'm not saying those people don't exist. I'm just not entirely convinced that it's as widespread as you suggested, if only because, I mean, literally the statistics say that about a third of the claims are being denied. So, and that was in Pigford 1. I mean, I think two things are going to happen. I think if you're right about the vast majority of these claims being fraudulent, I think we're going to find out about it in 2 years because of the degree to which the Government Accountability Office has been empowered to like really look through these claims. And they've been given the whole in terms of names, addresses, everything. I mean, I think these people a lot of these people who, if they have filed fraudulent claims, I think they're going to get caught. They may not necessarily get prosecuted, but I think we're going to find out if this has been the boondoggle that you guys are suggesting it is.
I think that's probably true. Hold on, I'm going to use a prop really quickly because I thought this was a fortuitously timed thing. I'm holding up to the camera a class action notification I got in the mail this weekend from the Federal District Court in Nevada, and it entitles me. This settlement entitles me to $10 from Hertz rental car because I rented a car at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas between date X and date Y, and I read through this thing closely. I don't even know if I'm going to file for it. I probably won't, but they charged a concession fee that they weren't legally allowed to. So I was looped into this class. I get the settlement. This is how this stuff usually works. In Pigford 1, they spent a lot of money trying to reach out through general interest and through African American publications and TV stations, trying to reach out to the class, making sure that they got everybody who was eligible. But in this case, this settlement I got, they know that I'm a member of the class because they went through the receipts of of Hertz Rental Car and saw that I'd rented a car between date X and date Y. So I'm a member of the class. So really what I have to do is go on a website, fill out my name, my address, and the number that's attached to this notification here, and they send me a check for $10 or $20. I think it's one or the other. But as you said, that's a problem in the Pigford case, not just because perhaps the government was, or I'll stipulate it, the members of the USDA office were just throwing potential evidence away, but also because in a lot of these cases, the claim was for Track A claims that the USDA wouldn't even give an application, wouldn't even start a paper trail, as it were. They would just deny.
Yeah.
So that, that's another big problem. And I agree that this could, on the one hand, be just a coordinated effort by the relevant parties, government parties, to hide evidence of discrimination, or it could be, again, just a perfect lacuna through which you can slip, a pretty easy fraud racket. But what I would say is, if you're right, and again, let's just say that it is the case that you're going to see similar ratios in Pigford 2 as you did in Pigford 1, something like 60%.
It's still about 66,000 people.
Okay, right. So let's say you're going to see similar ratios, approval and denial. My question remains: why are we dealing with something that looked like it was an ancillary question I had in this case that I didn't get into in the piece, and that I don't think is really talked about, is that was this, since the most compelling evidence for discrimination was statistical rather than sort of anecdotal or based on testimony, is this a disparate impact kind of discrimination? This is, it's a term of art that's come through civil rights litigation. Is it just the case that due to demographic features of the African American farmer community, or due to policies that weren't aimed at discrimination but had the effect of racial discrimination in the USDA, is this a disparate impact sort of thing? And I think that because the evidence is overwhelmingly statistical, the evidence for discrimination is statistical in nature rather than, as it were, evidence about the motives of these programs. That maybe what we're looking at is disparate impact. And so, this is all a roundabout way of getting me back to my central question, which is, if there really is all this discrimination going on, why are we dealing with it by cutting people checks for $50,000 and saying you're done? You can't, not only are we not going to change our practices, not only are we not going to root out the
people responsible.
The people responsible. And remember, this is something, again, we argued about in our exchange, that this was not a federally administered program. It was a federally funded program. But this was hundreds or thousands of locally elected boards that were presumably elected by boards of agriculture workers, farmers, who made decisions about who got these loans, all across the South, and in most cases elected by local populations. And there are anecdotes, again, of, for instance, discrimination claims coming out of a county in Arkansas where every member of the local board was African American. So that's just an anecdote. I'm not trying to make too much about it. But my point is, why aren't we dealing with this as we would any other disparate impact kind of discrimination? If and I'll stay agnostic for the moment over whether I think that's even a good idea. But it's a legitimate question. Why are we just cutting people $50,000 checks instead of saying we're going to change our policies, we're going to find out why this happened, and we're going to institute a program that makes sure it doesn't happen again, and we're going to make sure that black farmers thrive, or if that's the sort of social goal of this whole thing, rather than saying you get one crack at 50 grand, it's going to be easy, take it, walk away, and that's the last we want to hear from you.
If you listen to Vilsack, everybody sort of promised that this is never going to happen again.
Right.
There's a civil rights, there's the civil rights office is open again. Clinton opened it, during his term. I think that I think it's almost a different argument, like whether or not this was set up appropriately in order to meet exactly what it was, to do exactly what it was meant to do. I think that's an interesting and more complicated question. The one that I think I had a very visceral reaction to is this idea that the idea that this is constructed, and Breitbart insinuated this a lot more strongly than you did, that this is constructed in some way because Barack Obama is trying to funnel money to the black community for backdoor reparations, and I think I resented it, and I still do resent it, because anybody who looks at this case, I mean, anybody who's just sort of superficially hears about this case, what bothers them is the fact that the USDA spent so much time discriminating against black farmers, and like the USDA is like infamous for this. PBS did like a huge documentary on this, years ago, the civil rights. There's so much documentation of this, and so for people who are just sort of superficially looking at this case, it's just like, it really seems like a very straightforward story of racial injustice. Like, this is how the U.S. government used to do business, and now, and this is sort of, in some sense, a happy ending because, at least we caught it, in time to be able to do something about it for some of the people who it happened to who are still alive. And it's not like to say that, a lot's been made of the fact that Barack Obama sponsored a Pigford bill in 2007. I mean, Grassley sponsored a Pigford bill. The settlement passed again by unanimous consent in the Senate in December. I mean, this really, you have to really, really hate Barack Obama and really think some really nasty things about sort of the way that he thinks and the way that he thinks about race, to think that he secretly worked to engineer a way through which black people could take advantage of the government. And I think something that I also felt frustrated about in your piece was when you refer to sort of the alleged fraud in the Pigford settlement as sort of like a greater injustice than the one that sort of sparked the case in the first place. And I think I had a visceral reaction to that for the same reason that I think Barack Obama was talking about, not just that those 20 years at the USDA, but sort of the last century, which is that, I think of this as a sort of, I really do think of this as like just a very small chapter in a larger story about the USDA sort of, making sure that black people can own their own property and farm their own land for decades. Well, and the idea that, a settlement that is pretty much equal to like the amount of earmarks flagged by like the Tea Party caucus this year is like greater injustice than like the last century of like black farmers losing their property, just sort of rubbed me the wrong way.
Well, I can understand why it would. And let me say that the point of that sentence in the opening, this I think is a problem in this conversation, is that I was talking about Tim Pigford's discrimination claim, or let's even say the scope was the discrimination claim by Tim Pigford and the couple hundred other black farmers who joined the original class action suit. Okay, that's the scope of my comment. To say, whether this is a proxy for reparations and I didn't include the reparation stuff in my piece for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think that there's a plausible is the wrong word. I think there's a lot of interesting hangers on to the case, and you said that maybe that's in due course, but I think there's a lot of interesting hangers on to the case from the reparations community and et cetera. But so even if this is not a proxy for the reparations movement, nor is it a proxy, or should it be a proxy, for 100 years of discrimination. This is about, at the end of the day, the settlement was about discrimination between 1983 and 1997. So that, that's all I was talking about.
Yeah.
But let's get, and for the record, I don't think of Barack Obama's involvement in this case that way. I don't share that interpretation of it, if for no other reason than the fact that the BFAA, one of the big interest groups that sprung up out of this, endorsed George W. Bush in 1999 in a really unusual move, or maybe early 2000. But so this is not, and as you said, Grassley had a piece of this. This is not, I think, a partisan issue. But let's get meta here for a second, because you had a visceral reaction to my piece, and it was it was clear from your response that you did, and that kind of exchange, and we're having a very exquisitely civil exchange here on Blogging Heads, but that kind of exchange is exactly the reason why I dreaded writing about this, and I dreaded frankly doing this Blogging Heads, because there's absolutely, I think the Attorney General is exactly right that we're a nation of cowards on race, and this is why, because I have absolutely nothing to gain. I'm a part of the, as much as it might shock you, I'm a white conservative who grew up in the suburbs, but I'm a part of the same culture that you are, in the sense that I heard the same, I was told the same glowing stories about Dr. King in grade school. I went to the same public schools you did. I'm a part of the same set of social mores that rank racism as among one of the most unforgivable social crimes, as it were. That just, a scarlet letter unlike very few others. So there's absolutely nothing for me to gain. The best I can do is lose this argument, because even if I win it, my motives will be painted as suspect, or that I'm and this is what Coates at the Atlantic sort of tried to suggest in his response to a summary of my piece. He hadn't at that time read my piece. Was that he entitled his response "Somewhere Somebody Black is Getting Away with Something," as if and I would agree if all we cared about, or all our only interest in this case were to make sure that not a single minority got away with anything. Of course, that would be absurd. But there's a problem when you kind of insinuate that there's a conscious or subconscious or unconscious, I don't really know what you were insinuating, racism that motivates what I was doing. The idea to me is that since the allegation of racism in our culture is so incendiary. Now, I'm not saying it's like, calling somebody a rapist or a murderer, but as in terms of participation in polite society, and certainly public discourse, it's a pretty big disqualifier, right? You basically don't have to take somebody seriously if you're convinced that they're a committed racist. Okay, so because that's such a heavy charge, I think you really have to be careful with it. And frankly, it ties back into what's going on in Pigford, which is that the reason I think I'm concerned about it, and a lot of people on the right are concerned about it, is because by sort of invoking racism and institutional racism, you're wielding this tremendous power. It's become this tremendously powerful weapon. And so when we see interest groups and we perceive that what they're trying to do with that weapon is get some for their pet cause or their pet constituency, and sort of get paid and profit politically or profit financially from it, well, I think it's especially bad, because we have this intense prohibition on racism in the 21st century in America. At least in polite society, we do. Now, you might talk about the underbelly of American or something like that. I don't know, but at least in polite society, we do. And so to use that for nefarious ends, I think, is especially troubling. So yeah, I think there is reason to be as upset about fraud in this case as you would be about 300 or 400 black farmers who were discriminated against. I mean, because I think you're doing a lot of damage if that turns out to be true.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'll just say two things. I think. I'm written about this a lot. I think actually the accusation of racism is too toxic in American society, because the fact is that everybody's a little bit racist. It's like that song. I forget that puppet show that's on Broadway. There's that song like everybody's a little bit racist. I mean, it's just true, and it's weird. It's a little weird. There's actually like very different degrees of racism, and we don't really have a very good language for talking about it, right? I mean, there's sort of
I couldn't agree more.
There's ignorance. There's and even malicious.
There should be like a venial racism versus a mortal racism,
right?
Like
I mean,
to do with sins.
There's a big. I remember I was in Nevada, I was in Nevada and I had a cab driver who was, yelling nasty things at Hispanic people outside the window, and like there's that guy's a jerk, but he's not necessarily wearing a hood and burning crosses on somebody's lawn, and then there's people who want sort of make ignorant remarks about other people's culture, but just because they don't know better, not necessarily because they mean anything by it. And I think we don't really have a very good language for distinguishing between those things, but there's also a way in which I think people sometimes, what I reacted viscerally to in your piece was, I know nothing about these cases that are sort of, these other cases, these other class action suits involving Hispanic farmers or female farmers.
And women, yeah.
But, the assumption was just, the conclusion was based off the fact that, assuming that most of the claims in Pigford were fraudulent and that we were about to head towards another payoff for women and for minorities. Like I said, I had a visceral reaction to that because it's just sort of it's a narrative we hear all the time. It's like, you turn on Rush Limbaugh's program and he says something like, I don't know why black people are angry at the government. The government's been taking care of them their whole lives. Like, there's just a way in which, like, it feels like, just for me, I constantly feel like, I'm having to knock down the notion that, life as a minority in the United States is actually really easy because, the government does all these awesome things for you and, you have all these quote unquote extra rights and, it's just like, the conclusion fit just a sort of narrative that for me, I'm just like really sort of sick of hearing. And that's why I had a visceral reaction to it. It just sort of, whatever, okay, I've talked enough about it. Go ahead.
No, I can understand that. But I will say that if you want to accuse that conclusion of being purple or hyperbolic, fine. You might even be right. But I do happen to think, in reporting this story, I do think, as a matter of fact, that the vast majority, or let's just say the majority, of the outstanding Pigford claims are going to be fraudulent. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that is a matter of fact, and I think that there's good reason, considering some of the lawyers who are involved in these new cases, and considering some of the strategies and tactics that the interest groups advocating them have taken. There's good reason to think that these new settlements, when they come out, are going to be structured in a way that's going to encourage the same sort of thing. So I think those things as a matter of fact, but I'm open to being disabused of those notions.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll find out.
Yeah, okay. So let's.
I would say one last thing. I totally, my one thing I think I've always tried to do in my writing is to really try to separate, what I see as sort of, an action from a person. Right, so like I had a really visceral reaction to your conclusion, but I wasn't trying to say, I don't know what's in your heart. I wasn't trying to judge you in that way. I was really just trying to say, this is what this looks like to me, and this is why I found it frustrating. I wasn't trying to make a broader allegation about you as a person. But when it comes to stuff like this, I think it's very difficult to avoid for a lot of the reasons that you just discussed.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, let's snap our fingers a couple times at the screen and wake up our viewers and segue to the talk a little bit about the kind of big burning, and we hope at this point not literally burning
Wisconsin protest.
Wisconsin, yeah. And I'm curious to hear what your take on the whole thing is, because as a New Jersey resident and a big fan of Governor Christie, who's a sort of bane of the public sector unions, and has managed successfully, this is neither here nor there, but has managed successfully, his big victory in New Jersey was in turning, as it were, the private sector unions against the public sector unions. The Democratic president of the New Jersey State Senate is an iron worker and a union rep, and he's now cheerleading for pension reforms and collective bargaining reforms among public sector unions. So, as a fan of what Christie did, and as I've been slowly educating myself on what's going on in Wisconsin, I think that the left's response to Walker's budget plan, while totally understandable from a power politics standpoint, I think that they're doing absolutely what they should be doing in the perfectly realistic sense that they're trying to maintain political benefits that they enjoy. I think it's not warranted by the level of the reforms that we're talking about. But I suspect you disagree.
So I'm probably like the worst economic liberal in the world, but I guess my beef has always been this. I think, if you want to get accountability from the unions, especially public sector unions, there's a way to do that without trying to destroy them, sort of as a political entity. I mean, if you look at, in Washington, D.C., the teachers union was simply, it was too powerful to destroy, and to seek to do so would have hampered her efforts at doing anything. But, you look at what Michelle Rhee did in Washington, D.C., she basically rejiggered the system so that it's not just based on how long you've been teaching, but how good of a teacher you are. You can be fired now, for being a bad teacher based on evaluations. And I think that, speaking as someone who went to DC public schools, I was totally in favor of that. And I think if you want to, the unions in Wisconsin have already said, you can cut our benefits, fine, but don't take away our collective bargaining. And I think that's the issue for me is, it's one thing to say, we got to cut your benefits because there's a deficit, and I think there's a big question as to whether or not that deficit is Walker's fault to begin with. But, to say we're going to take away your collective bargaining rights and try to destroy you as a political entity, that's politics. That's political science 101. That's one side going after the other side's constituency. That's not really about fiscal health for the state or anything else.
Well, I think it's both. Of course, I'm going to agree that from a partisan standpoint, it's in the interest of elected Republicans if organized labor were not as powerful a political force. But that shouldn't obscure the fact that there is actually a real fiscal consequence, and there is not just in Wisconsin, but in a lot of states, to the extraordinary collective bargaining powers of public sector unions, it's become very fashionable to quote FDR on public sector unions, and I'm gonna do it too, or at least I'm going to refer to him. But he understood, and I think that before the second half of the century, I think it was Kennedy who allowed the first organization of federal workers. Before the second half of the century, there was an understanding that there was just a fundamental difference between allowing an organized labor movement among public workers, because not only were they in a position politically to elect their bosses, as it were, but there's your kind of fiduciary relationship with the people you serve is violated by situations like this. This will have done, no matter how it turns out, this will have done tremendous damage to the relationship between teachers and the elected officials who help create policy and determine how much they're going to make and what their benefits are. And right on down the line, this will have done tremendous damage to that. And I think that's something that you only really get with organized labor in the public sector. Now, from a tactical standpoint, I think that what you said about the unions being willing to negotiate on pensions and benefits is right. And if that was Walker's point here, then it was a brilliant play, because in a significant sense, he's already won that battle. He's gotten. Think of how extraordinary that is. He's gotten. If he had set the bar far lower, if Walker had come out and said, well, we want to negotiate benefit cuts, well, then that would have been the line that the public sector union, I think we can probably agree that that's the case, that would have been the line that the public sector unions drew in the sand, and they would have fought on that line. But so since he set the bar so much higher, although I want to get back to that in a second, I don't think what's happening here is all that radical. He's gotten the unions to come out and say that no, we'll take benefit cuts, just don't take away our collective bargaining rights. But so let me just run down really quickly what's gonna happen if Walker gets his way. The biggest thing is they're not going to be able to collectively bargain on health benefits and pensions. They'll still be able to collectively bargain on wages. They're not going to be able to bargain on benefits and health, which is important because that's where so much hidden cost is, and it's really easy for especially local elected officials to make promises on pensions to please certain constituency, to please that that constituency. It's easy because it's they won't be around when those funding promises come due. So I think that's an important thing to do.
Two things.
I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. No, the other thing to keep in mind is that all the protections that these employees enjoy via the civil service laws in that state will stay in effect. So this is not going to gut kind of a lot of the benefits that come with organization. It is going to control, I think, almost certainly the growth of pension and health obligations to those people.
But he's also going after dues. Like he's making it. He's going to make it very difficult for the unions to constitute themselves, and they know that, and everybody knows that. And I mean, I think to say like, well, they're getting these generous benefits, with healthcare. I mean, what's happening is that healthcare costs too much, and it's continuing to cost more every day, every year. It just the costs keep going up. I think like what I find weird is that conservatives always seem to point to like that they say they argue that public employees are better compensated relative to their counterparts in the private sector, and it really depends how you count that. I mean, depending on how you count the numbers, it's either true or not true, and obviously one side counts them one way and another side counts them the other. But to say that well, private sector unionization is down far enough to where people are really struggling to pay for their health care, we should put public workers in the same situation. Like as much as I was happy that got it so that you could actually be fired for doing a bad job as a teacher in DC. Being a teacher, teacher in DC or in Wisconsin, you don't make that much money. I mean, this idea that these people are making money hand over fist, it really is not that lucrative to be a public school teacher. It's a pretty thankless job, and if we paid people more for it, we'd probably get better teachers. But this idea that sort of these public, I hate the idea that the sort of way of looking at public workers out there and the people protesting that these people are greedy. I mean, they're essentially fighting for their lives as an organization, as a political entity. It's a bit more than just we don't want to take a pay cut.
No, that's right. I mean, so I think that there's a reasonable middle ground, or that there's a reasonable there can be something like a reasonable consensus that, for instance, Walker asking them to pay 5.8% into their pensions, which is about the national average, and 12 and some odd % into their health benefits, which is about half the national average, is not unreasonable. I think that the great big middle of this country can agree to that.
Yeah.
Now, I am going to, as a dyed-in-the-wool conservative, say that you're right. He is going after the ability of public institutions to collect union dues. He's going after. He wants a secret ballot for organization votes, and he wants yearly he wants yearly referendum on the continued existence of a given union, and he I totally lost track of my last point. But so he is going after some of the he's going after some of the tools that unions use to kind of perpetuate themselves. Now, I'm going to say that's a good thing. Okay, but you're right. There is an area on this topic where I think reasonable people can disagree, obviously based on where you're coming from. But you're right that it's not lucrative, at least at the median. I'll give you that. The median teacher salary is certainly in Wisconsin is not exorbitant, although, like a lot of public jobs, people at the, seniority comes with certain benefits. But it, and from the standpoint of, I'm sorry, I'm drifting a little here, but the most unfair aspect of this to me, and I was sympathetic with teachers on this in New Jersey and public workers in New Jersey, and I'm sympathetic with teachers and public workers in Wisconsin, is that these were promises made foolishly and insincerely, I would say, but these were promises made by previous administrations, at the local, county, state level. These pension promises, these benefit promises were promises made, and now and in some cases they're gonna have to be broken to save the fiscal situation in the state. So that I'm sympathetic with, but breaking promises is one thing. Saying that moving forward we're not going to extend these unreasonable benefits to future going forward in the years ahead, I think is a completely different thing, and I think it's absolutely. I mean, I
would disagree with you on whether or not they're unreasonable, but I will say that my point is merely that they're willing to talk over that stuff. And I think generally you'd get like a fairly large plurality of liberals to say, okay, we should negotiate over this. But when you're talking about stripping these people of their bargaining rights on, a lot of the stuff that matters, and limiting their ability to reconstitute themselves, I mean, I think that's where someone like me, who often I don't really write that much about economic issues. Most of my stuff is rights oriented, legal stuff. National security, that stuff. I mean, that's where I sort of have an instinctive emotional reaction, like, you're not being fair to these people.
Yeah, I mean, this debate doesn't need to get that much more abstract, so I apologize in advance. but I always, when we're talking about, for instance, how much people deserve to make, or what a teacher deserves to make. You can't help but sound like a heartless bastard when you say what I'm about to say, but I just think it's absolutely true. People should make what they're worth, and it's a I think really incontrovertible fact of the history of the world, the civilized world, that the best instrument for determining what people are worth is a market, is an open market. Now, you could talk about the social value assigned to teaching and how crucial it is to the constitution of a society, but all of that stuff should be built into a price. I mean, as an economic conservative or a classical liberal in that sense, I have tremendous hope that a price and a market can do all of that work if left to its own devices. I mean, and again, I apologize for making this debate more abstract than it needs to be, but that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day is, are you comfortable saying that political forces can, or interest group politics can decide, and the exercise of political power can decide what a teacher's worth? That makes it sound nefarious. But
private companies do it all the time. I mean, we don't live in a perfect market. We have, the way the legal structure is set up. I mean, there are certain perks for certain people, and whether you're, if you're a corporation, you're going to try to rig the system in your favor, depending on what industry you're in, what kind of goods you produce, and that happens all the time.
Agreed.
The fact that the public sector unions and unions in general provide a counterbalance to some of that in a way that, there's almost nothing else in American society does. So even when I'm generally not on their side, like when I was with Bree, I still the fact that they exist is something I generally consider a good thing.
Yeah, but this is, and we can wrap this up, but this is a debate I find myself having with people on the left all the time, and I think that the historical and bureaucratic structure of corporatism in this country, and just the Baroque kind of Byzantine structure of corporatism in this country is such that it really obscures what's really going on. So I would absolutely agree with you that in the private sector there's a lot of
rent-seeking,
corporate capture and rent-seeking and all that stuff. I mean, we would just disagree on whether the solution to that is to staple on more regulations or to just burn the MFR down, which is sort of how I feel about it. I mean, just to give one quick example, we had this debate when they effectively nationalized large parts of the student loan market as an ancillary benefit of Obamacare. Think about how perverse this debate is. You had, before Great Society, you had a totally private educational loan market. It was a program by LBJ, okay, that started the federal subsidization and underwriting of student loans, okay, and at the time it was hailed as a great liberal victory. And then fast forward 40 years, and you have liberals making the argument, why are we subsidizing these greedy fat cat bankers, to give student loans?
I mean, it's 25% interest on some of these loans. I mean,
I know. No, I'm not saying it's not ridiculous. But what I'm saying is that the proposed remedy to this is not to undo the policy that created this situation. It's to fully nationalize that, So I don't think it's any coincidence that tuition rates skyrocketed as the growth of the corporatist relationship between the student loan industry and the government grew. But the solution to that is not to nationalize the student loan industry; it's to end the corporatism. I mean, I see that I think that general form of argument for conservatives applies to so many playing fields.
Well, I mean, I'm a liberal in the sense that I very strongly feel like the government should help people who, aren't able to help themselves. And the government provides a lot of loans for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to go to school, who, are otherwise well equipped to go to college, and ability to go to college. So, I mean, I guess it just, there's some areas in which that kind of thing bothers me, but when it comes to student loans, I was very happy with what the Obama administration did.
And you don't think those loans would be available on a private market?
No, I mean, I don't know, but generally, private markets aren't always great at seeing. Something like a long-term investment in a human being human beings are pretty capricious. I could very much understand a private market not wanting to get involved in doing that without the kind of generous underwriting that the U.S. government used to do, except, in the case of, pushing students even further in debt than they might otherwise be if they were just getting a loan from the government.
Okay. I think we're running a little bit long.
We're running a little bit long. Anyway, it's great to talk to you.
Absolutely, Adam. This was, I think, a fruitful conversation.
Absolutely.
And good to talk to you. Have a good rest of your President's Day.
You too. Take care.
Wait. Oh. First, favorite president. Favorite and least favorite president. Let's do it.
Oh, I guess it would have to be favorite Lincoln, least favorite Buchanan.
Buchanan. Excellent. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Excellent choices. I would probably... Geez, you're going to make me sound like a jerk. I would say Lincoln, and then least favorite would be Wilson, because I think he did a lot of damage. But Buchanan is a noble and bipartisan choice. So
so is Lincoln, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Okay.
All right, take care, Dan.
Anyway, talk to you later.
Peace.
Bye.